Hello and a warm welcome to this 10th session of Introduction to International Relations. For this presentation, we're going to be looking at war and international security, and we're going to be looking at about how war itself has evolved over time, some key theories and concepts connected with it. And again, as per usual, not only will I be bringing in theory and concepts, but I'll be giving some historical context to war and international security, how and why it's evolved over time, and so on. So without further ado, I will share the screen with you again. And again, I have an image, but this image now needs less interpretation than some other opening slides that I've shown you. Here you can see a US military unit, in Afghanistan. A war that, as you know, took place between 2001 and 2014, and in some other veins still continues for the US and other nation states, as well as, of course, Afghans themselves. And this is the conventional image of what one thinks of when one sees war and international security. As you know from the feminist slides, and to a certain extent post-structuralist ones as well, we know that war itself affects many different groups within a society. And as you will see in this presentation and hear about, war is not just between two states. It works on a whole range of different levels, also with sub-state actors, particularly in the post-Cold War context, we can see this. And again, next term for foreign policy analysis, there will be one presentation I go through with you, which looks at international security and how international security itself is a contested concept, and how more critical approaches say that security itself is not just politico-military relations. Nonetheless, this opening slide, I want to give a sense of what we will look at. So we will obviously also, though, look at how war is commonly perceived, at least by realists, and then I will bring in liberalism, constructivism. But I want to, and again, emphasize this, that war itself, war and international security, is not just this politico-military relations that is commonly thought of when we think of war and international security. So, what is security? So realists, again, I will emphasize, start off with realism. And again, this anarchical system that we live in a world where there's no supranational authority to protect us. We as, again, main units of analysis, states. So we have to, particularly in this Westphalian system, post 1648, states being front and center. We can see this, of course, more recently, especially in the post-Second World War context, and increasingly more and more nation states that now exist in the world. But for realists, security is maintenance of state sovereignty, territorial integrity. Yes, we've been recognized, we as a state actor, and the authority within a particular state has the right and responsibility to protect its own people. Again, classical realists like Hans Morgenthau, the polis, the community, that is the utmost important for policymakers, political leaders, to protect their own people within a certain context vis-a-vis others. And again, for realists, there's an emphasis on the state and the state's relations with other states. For neoliberals or liberal institutionalists, again, there's more of an emphasis on economics. So it's how an actor, state actor, and sometimes, of course, non-state actors, but conventionally, when we look at security, there is an emphasis on the state and its relations with others. So the emphasis of how an actor, whether state or non-state actor, uses resources to benefit itself, and how it acquires resources. And this is something, of course, that Marxists and others would critique and say, well, it's a way that the more powerful maintain their own position. But nonetheless, according to liberals, there can be, of course, in a war, it's not a win-win situation, but there can be a sharing of resources that, let's say, prevents from going to war. And as you know, with trade, interdependence, the more two actors trade with one another, the more they become dependent on one another, the less likely they go to war, according to liberal institutionalist thought. And finally, constructivism, an emphasis here on perception. If how we collectively perceive a certain situation is, and other actors and ourselves, it's also how our relations will unfold. And often, again, post-structuralist thought, often we make up we perceive ourselves in a particular way, and then we will articulate others as different, and this is potentially conflictual. Again, I would emphasize that in this particular presentation, I'm not going into great detail on this, but for foreign policy analysis next semester, constructivism, feminism, more critical approaches to security, sometimes, let's say, you'll come across these terms like the Copenhagen School, Aberystwyth School next semester. But basically, an emphasis on security is something not just politico-military. We have to expand it to bring in other notions of security, whether environmental, as you can see here, food, water, how people on the ground are affected, cultural. So security is something more than just politico-military relations. But again, for constructivists, this large umbrella, security is how we perceive it. We perceive ourselves in a particular way. If we are friendly with others, then that will create a certain level of security. If we perceive others as different in a negative sense of the term, then it's likely to make the situation between us and others as more insecure. What is peace? Well, according to realists, it's a pause between wars. So yes, it's the case that two actors, particularly state actors, may have friendly relations now or have alliances now, but that's not axiomatic. That's not something that will always be in place, and it's often a pause between wars. For neoliberals, liberal institutionalists, it's this notion of efficiency, that actually it's more efficient, it's better for us, both sides. Again, the trade, notions of trade, free trade is important here, that it's a win-win situation between two state actors, and therefore maintenance of peace is important for the benefit of both sides. And finally, constructivist. Security community is a term that in the IR literature goes back to the 1950s, 1957, and Ernst Hasse's work. Immanuel Adler and Michael Barnett, two major constructivist IR theorists, have written a book on and have edited a book on the security community. And this notion of shared beliefs, ideas, practices between different actors, it's this, again, to use this term of an umbrella, that we're all part of the same community, Gemeinschaft, and that we identify with one another. A post-structuralist would go further and make the point, actually, it's often we need another, whether it's Russia or Islamic terrorism in the post-9/11 context, to solidify this community. But whatever the case for constructivists, this community is something where there's shared belief systems, norms, values that create and reinforce. So it goes beyond just self-interest. All for one, one for all. What is war? Well, again, like any term, there's a range of different definitions. And again, one has to think theoretically how that will inform one's definition. Here are 2 or 3 definitions on this slide. This first definition, the deliberate use of large-scale coercion by one state against another state to further some policy goal. So deliberate use of large-scale coercion by one state against another to further some policy goal. And this makes sense because there's always an objective trying to achieve something. Coercion's involved. You can't just do it by persuasion here. It's gone beyond that, hence we've gone to war. But nonetheless, there's got limitations, this definition, in that we're emphasizing state to state. We know, and especially again in the post-Cold War context, sub-state actors, civil wars, interstate conflicts are much more the norm today. So it's often not the case between state and other states. But nonetheless, this is a working definition that one could use. It's applicable. Next definition, the major theorist of war, Karl von Clausewitz, that he wrote on his great book on war, which I highly recommend, is his Hegelian dialectical approach to understanding war. A major thinker, Clausewitz, in war, security studies, etc. So a name you should know, and read his work on war. War is the continuation of politics by other means. So for Clausewitz, you can never take this relationship between war and politics, you can never disconnect them. So politics about communication, about trying to achieve certain objectives for one's own as an actor in relations to other actors, etc. War is a continuation of it. It's something that, in a sense, always is connected, and it can often be a failure, of course, of communication, diplomacy between different actors, between 2 actors or multiple actors in some cases. But it's the case that actually that for war to take place, politics has failed in some ways, but the other point that's important here, within war, there's nearly always often communication between the warring parties, of what they're trying to achieve, and what, let's say, the other side, whether the other side eventually, to use a very warlike term, eventually surrenders. There's a terminology, and as we know with the Geneva Conventions, looking at international ethics, we can see that there's also jus in bello, there's ethics within war. Now, Clausewitz did not necessarily go into great detail on ethics, but he just made the point that there is always communication. It's very rare that we have what's known as total war, but even in total war, this is notion that one side can defeat the other, and therefore we come to a more peaceful outlook once the war's been resolved. So war is the continuation of politics by other means. There's always a relationship between these entities. And next, Hedley Bull, a major thinker of the English school, looking at how international order comes about, and how history and belief systems and values play a role. So again, this quotation is quite similar to Max Weber's work and quotation that I referred to last time, that the state has a monopoly on violence. Here, Hedley Bull looking at the international order between actors, particularly state actors. It's organized violence carried out by political units against one another, against each other. The English school, by the way, is a school of thought that brings in history, values, belief systems, has some connections with constructivism. How much is an open-ended debate within the literature? But Hedley Bull, a major thinker in this school, and also a major thinker more broadly for IR theory. So the nature of war, how it's evolved. We can look at how it's evolved from the classical times, and so on to medieval, but I'm going to put an emphasis here on modernity and the relevance of it for leading up to the 20th and 21st century, and the rise of nationalism. Whether we think of the great Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, how nationalism is such a driving force for international relations more broadly, but you can't take away or ignore the rise of the European empires from the 15th century all the way up really to the end of the 19th century. We know the 20th century, there was a rise of other actors from other regions. But this time period and the range of European empires was this centralization of nation states, how they could increase their power through having a strong bureaucracy, strong civil service, relationship between state and business, whether we think of the British Empire and the East India Company, and rising populations, education, mass education, increasing literacy, and here the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th century, and a range of major thinkers, whether René Descartes, John Locke, Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant, who I referred to in the last presentation on ethics. These major thinkers were also part of, and thinking critically, rationally, challenging superstition. Each of these, let's say, components, and modernity, the term that's used here, were components in, let's say, the rise of powers, European powers. And it also led to, let's say, by having, let's say, spreading education slowly but surely, at least, because this is something that really only properly takes place in the 19th, early 20th century, and mass education and so on. But the key point that I want to emphasize here is that eventually it leads to mass armies, that we have a notion of a nation state that we can call up compulsory or voluntarily. This changes over time, of course, depending on historical context, but we have mass armies that can fight against others to protect our own state. And whether we look now at the Napoleonic Wars, and we look at, let's say in this case, looking at Napoleonic Wars from the end of the 18th century, so the time period 1798, 99, to 1815, a key important war predominantly between the French and their allies against the British, the Prussians and others fighting against Napoleonic France. But it's here where international law evolves, and how there are agreements between different European powers and the notion of sovereignty. But warfare itself is evolving at this stage. Technology is developing. The Industrial Revolution in the UK, in Britain and elsewhere means that things are speeding up. And this also pertains to war and how, let's say, different technologies are used. Going into the 20th century with the Navy, later on the having nation states having air forces, going up into the, let's say, post-Second World War context. And we can see how the world, globalization, of course, as a concept, as you've had in global economy and other modules, is something that has been around for thousands of years. But in, let's say, the last 100, 150 years, how increasing intertwining, not just economically, but culturally, politically, diplomatically, this has led to an evolution in terms of how warfare is fought, also now in the post-Cold War context. And I will say more about this shortly, but I just want to emphasize a few things and bring in, again, historical context, the nature of war. Whether you say one says it's human nature, whether you say it's structural, there's always relations between social and political aspects, how things evolve, and how we perceive war, how we see it. So within a society that, let's say, constructivism now perceives war as a right thing, it's something to use, and feminist thought critiques this, but to be manly within a society, or to what it means to be a great country, etc. You can see how this is something that has evolved over time, our mindsets. Today, arguably, at least in a number of countries, one doesn't say one wants to go to war because it's inherently a good thing, it's to protect others. And this shows that how we put our belief systems is that war is not seen as a good thing in and of itself. It's usually seen by, also, I'm talking now about citizens, as their last resort. And technological advances, here, me presenting to you like this, let's say over a computer or a laptop, but technological advances also evolve with the society, and it changes how war is thought about and fought. And again, I just want to give a historical context. The 30 Years' War, so a war within Europe, almost a European civil war, led to modernity and led to the Enlightenment, which led to let's say, various empires in Europe, and subsequently other state actors becoming powerful, like the US, Japan, and so on, especially going towards the end of the 19th century, a speeding up of how we do war, and so on. So the Cold War, as we know, two major powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and then that both actors, state actors, the very different ideologies, supporting often one actor within a country, whether in Africa, Asia, Latin America. So proxy wars, often these major powers supporting a particular actor within a particular country. In the aftermath of the Cold War, so the post-Cold War context, and here I put an emphasis on the United States, but other very developed economies and militaries could be looked at, whether Russia, China, various European countries, India, etc. But for the United States and the Pentagon, the revolution in military affairs is very important. How one can do asymmetrical warfare, where you don't necessarily need many ground troops, that you have, let's say, technological evolution and innovation so that you can fight war from the air. So the Balkans War in the 1990s, a lot of it was fought from the air, particularly the United States and other NATO countries. But we can look at the Gulf War a lot previously, 1991, how you don't need many ground troops anymore, especially if you are extremely developed military, the way the US is. But it has problems as well, of course, and needing ground troops and counterinsurgency, getting on the ground, also has its own advantages as well as disadvantages. But it's something that's seen within, let's say, Washington, in the Pentagon and so on, revolution in military affairs, is that you don't need to necessarily fight wars with ground troops. You have many different ways of doing it. And actually, there are more effective ways, according to RMA specialists, in fighting wars. And again, as you can imagine, there's a range of views on this. There's not some that agree with what I've just said, some that would disagree with that point. But nonetheless, there are now different ways of how warfare is happening. And it's not just ground-to-ground combat troops. Often, even the rise of drones, let's say during the Obama administration, you can see how technology is being used for better or worse in the countries in question, whether we talk about the example I just gave, the Obama administration of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, etc. Postmodern war. And postmodern wars, a term, postmodern, post-structuralism. Again, there are connections between these two terms, but how actually it's not, again, front and center the state and the authorities. Actually, increasingly, you can see with wars, not just in Afghanistan, but wars in Africa and other, let's say, Afghanistan, other Asian countries elsewhere. Increasingly, the Balkans of the 1990s, there are, but particularly I want to re-emphasize, let's say again, Afghanistan or Iraq, the post 9/11 wars, as they sometimes are known. There are more private contractors, private authorities, business benefits from it. So it's much more, in this sense, decentralized, disaggregated. And often this has been, the governments themselves have, let's say, given resources to some of these actors that I've just referred to. And this disaggregates, decentralizes, makes things more fluid, which is what makes it a postmodern war. And very important here, Derrida, an important post-structuralist IR theorist, media has become, who's done work on this, media, as has, David Campbell, another important post-structuralist and constructivist scholar, media is becoming more important in terms of shaping understanding of particular wars, so that how war is understood. And again, some French post-structuralists have looked at this too. But media itself, so what we perceive as right, media constructs what is right or wrong, tries to make us understand something, but it's very difficult for us living here in whether here in the UK or in Germany, whatever the case might be, to understand a lot of wars, because we just see it through our computer screens, through television, through broadcasting. And it's very important how the media portrays, represents it, in terms of how we understand it. But again, we're not directly experiencing it. So it's quite a different effect to how war would have once been when we would have directly affected it. And again, a taboo against the use of nuclear weapons has developed in the global system, which also brings in constructivism, norms and belief systems, but actually something now that actually, again, the state is not, and this centralized authority is not front and center anymore. New wars, and Mary Calder's work is important here, an LSE scholar. It's often, again, leading on from postmodern wars, this disintegration of states that we've seen in the post-Cold War context, and you have sub-state actors trying to get resources, trying to have influence. This is much more the norm of how wars are taking place over the last 30 odd years. And yes, there's disintegration and fragmentation within states, or also globalization more broadly. And again, it's often within a state how an army might use it against an unarmed civilian population, leading to more bloodshed within the state and civil war and interstate context. And also identity being important. I referred to Rwanda in a previous presentation, of how wars, that horrendous genocide that took place in 1994 in Rwanda, one ethnic group attempting to, and in some cases successfully, unfortunately, exterminating up to 900,000 people, Hutus against the Tutsis. This horrible, horrible factor of identity rearing its ugly head. Identity, of course, doesn't always have to rear its ugly head, because identity can also be a more constructive aspect. But how wars take place, how identity is used also within states, between different groups, and in the case of Rwanda, leading to a horrible, horrible outcome. But the point is that wars, according to Mary Calder and others, have evolved over time, and so this term new wars has some resonance. Post-Westphalian warfare, so again, Westphalian system, 1648, this notion of states being front and center, having territorial sovereignty, integrity, etc. Again, in the post-Cold War context, I emphasize, between states, this is much less the norm than it once was. And we can look at this empirically. We can look at data. We can look at wars that take place or conflict. And there's big methodological questions about how you define a term, the term such as war. So this is also contentious. But the point is that historically and much more recent times, sub-state actors have increasingly become important in terms of wars fought, conflict, etc. And we can't ignore critically issues of poverty, stability, development, peace, and how they are interlinked with security and or intersecurity. So post-Westphalian, it's not all about state-to-state conflict the way realists would historically or do want us to look at. Actually, it's much more fragmented and you cannot take any of these key issues out of the equation, and how sub-state actors are increasingly important. Types of war, total war. In total war, whether we look at Napoleonic wars or the case of Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1944, 1945, the Second World War, of course, but I look at the European part, that it's unrestricted. Weapons can be used in an unrestricted way, and against civilians, etc., and whatever the case might be. So it challenges notions of the Geneva Conventions, that we have, and so on, and actually the rules of war, jus and bello, as we looked at with ethics, are largely speaking thrown out. Why? Because a state wants to, or states, a group of states wants to have total, let's say, complete victory. And I gave the example, the most extreme, worst example of Nazi Germany, but this example doesn't just have to pertain to a most extremely we directly evil regime, but other regimes or empires that want to achieve total victory. Total war is an approach that can be used, strategically speaking, although more difficult in today's world. Limited war, limited in terms of what can be used, and again, jus and bello, what's right in war. And actually, you can achieve things in different ways. You don't need to completely obliterate the other side to achieve your goals, and often this is the case in war. That's why both sides continually are talking with one another. And we know in the post-Second World War context with the major powers, and spreading to some extent of nuclear weapons of mass destruction more broadly, that actually it's very difficult. If two sides both have nuclear weapons, then it's impossible to go to war. When I say impossible, the reason why I say it's impossible is that notion that actually one side wouldn't use nuclear weapons against the other, a notion that Kenneth Waltz has written about. Of course, we can challenge that notion, but nonetheless, the argument here is that nuclear weapons have also constrained actors with one another. So limited war is something much more the norm. And finally, civil war, war within a single sovereign state over the control or partition of that state. Civil war, or sometimes known as intra-state, but within a state, intra, often there are different actors, and again, sub-state actors vying for influence, control of resources, etc., etc. What policy goals? So what goals do policymakers try to achieve? And here I'm going to give you three terms I refer to: compellence, to compel another actor to do something; deterrence, to prevent them from doing something that you don't want them to do, but you don't necessarily need to do anything offensive to achieve that, but because you can achieve your goal without actually attacking another, but you have that deterrence because you can, in a sense, frighten the other. And third, status seeking, a more constructivist approach of how you want to be perceived by your own people and by others, by your own people, by your own populace, I should say, and others. You want to increase one's own status. So Russia, let's say, in its neighborhood, Putin would want to increase its own, let's say, status by being more powerful or influential within different parts of its neighborhood. The same for the US, the same for China, the same for a whole host of major powers and or medium-sized powers. So, compellence. A set of decisions, policies, and actions intended to force an opponent to take some action, as opposed to, in the next slide, deterring the adversary not to take a different action. So it's something more sort of like forward, positive in that sense, from a state actor's perspective at least, in that it's intending to force it. So by we do this, and by doing this, this prevents you from doing something, or then you will back down from doing something. So here you've got the goal is to change the actor's incentives. So an actor B has to rethink what it wants to do and won't do what it originally was thinking of doing. You've got here the Cuban Missile Crisis as the example, Cold War, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons, or sorry, missiles transferred to Cuba. This is obviously a major case study that we can look at and may well look at in foreign policy analysis next semester. And there was a whole range that both Moscow and Washington, range of options both sides had. But looking at Washington and the Kennedy administration's response. It had different options, but John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, decided that a naval blockade and the threatening of an invasion of Cuba with force from the missiles was the way to do it. But it didn't actually attack Cuba, as we know, which could have led to something much more extreme. Dare I say, nuclear Armageddon. It found between its options, some sort of middle way, where the Soviet Union backtracked. Of course, there's more to it than that, in that both the Soviet Union and the United States were, during October 14 to 28, starting to speak more with one another. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they established a direct line between the Kremlin and the White House. But the point being, and there was the United States quietly agreed to take its own missiles out of Turkey, and basically, in this case, the United States managed to alter the incentives of the Soviet Union according to this example. But it's very difficult to do, hence you can see on this next slide. Why? Because often this involves communication, and the target or the other actor has to understand and also has to rectify and be seen in a positive light by its own populace, etc. Next one, so that's compellence, doing something to achieve a certain outcome, but something active is needed to be done to prevent and to make sure that another actor changes what it's going to do. Deterrence, on the other hand, is a credible threat, and a threat that can be used to use force, if another actor changes its behavior. A credible threat, though, it has to be seen as credible. So not just threatening for the sake of it, not threatening if you are a small actor in many cases, but it's often to another one is to change their incentives. But again, deterrence is something that's not proactive. It can threaten in a very, let's say, by using argument, by using rhetoric, but it doesn't directly do something. But it's always, in a sense, the possibility it could do something. It's what deters the other side, prevents the other side from doing something, because they're afraid that if they do something, so actor B, if actor B does do something, actor A will respond in a very strong, extreme way, whatever the case might be, so it doesn't do something because it has that threat in mind. And so this credible threat to use force changes another actor's behavior and prevents it from doing something that perhaps it would want to do. So let's say Taiwan wanting to go for full independence. It knows that it declares full independence. This is another big case study, that it can only walk a certain path, go a certain way, and has to restrain itself. Why? Because of China's own, let's say, a credible threat that it's given to Taiwan, that it could use force at any moment. Of course, whether China would use force on Taiwan and the question of Taiwan independence or Taiwan connected to China, this is a big, major case. But the point is, China has arguably successfully used deterrence. Likewise, the US and US foreign policy, in a range of cases, often hasn't needed to invade a country. It's often been able to deter. So let's say when we look at countries in the Middle East, it's deterred them from doing certain things. Sometimes it's had a relations with certain leaders, dictators, what have you. But often it's said to countries that it has a not so positive relationship with, or a bad relationship with, it deters them from doing something by actually threatening but not needing directly to do something. So having the military nearby or the navy nearby to a country in the Middle East, the US has done that without directly attacking a country, but it's a form of deterrence. And again, as you can see from this final slide, connected on those points, no actual violence is necessary if it's done effectively. And realists put an emphasis on deterrence, whether for the US or some other state actor, in that you can achieve things often better through this way, through the credible threat to use force, but 9 times out of 10, you don't need to use it. Status seeking, and here we can bring in constructivism, the use of military capability to enhance prestige for whatever country, small, large, whatever it might be. And you want to do it, and often it's rallying around the flag that you do it. So even if people domestically disagree with you, they will support you because there's a unified approach as a state, as a nation state. And it's often to lower the prestige of other actors, so undermine another actor, another state actor in this case. And often it can use, and especially today, 2020, the newest, most high-tech weapons, And today, this is much more the case than it once was, of course. And this is not just against great powers, because this can be status seeking. Great powers themselves can also status seek, but often it can also be used to challenge great powers. So asymmetrical from the other way around. So let's say in this case that, let's say, smaller actors can, let's say, if they're supported by others sometimes too, they can actually challenge great powers. And this is an interesting a range of cases. When we look at, let's say, the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese, by 1973, when the United States left, had, in a sense, gained status, not only amongst Vietnamese populace, but also amongst the international community more broadly. Explaining War and Peace. Now you've got 3 images, unit of analysis. This refers back to Kenneth Waltz's work, Not Theory of International Politics, an earlier book he wrote, where he brings in there's 3 units of analysis, and it's not just Kenneth Waltz. There are other thinkers who've looked at this, but how you have to understand how and why war and or peace takes place. You have to look at it on 3 levels. The first image is individuals. So classical realists again put an emphasis on human nature, that there's something inherently conflictual within us, whether it's an aspect of, and I don't want to get too Freudian here, but how, let's say, childhood for human beings and how they are conflictual from that, but also the social context, environmental context. But we are inherently within us as human beings, we have this competitive, conflictual aspect to us. First image is therefore human nature, and we just need to restrain that side to our nature. Second image is states, and how they're formed, how they're developed, how they're institutionalized, and how they're competitive with one another. So a very realist notion. And especially for Kenneth Waltz's work, but also for other realists here, the international system shapes us and determines what we do. Yeah, so yes, it's the case that human nature is important, states, but particularly for structural realists, as you know, the third image is most important. It's the international system. We have inherent, because of this anarchical system, it makes it more likely, not necessarily absolute, because as we know, everything has degrees to it. And remember, structural realists are skeptical of a lot of wars, only if it's absolutely necessary. But anyway, the international system can make it make it more likely that one goes to war with another within certain contexts. Why war? Well, here we can look at a range of factors, but necessary conditions, again, for realists, we look at the anarchical system. We don't trust others. We need to protect ourselves because there's no supranational authority to protect oneself. Conflicting wants, again, it's a zero-sum game between A and B, or so relative gains. A gets more than B, it's a relative gain for A. There's conflicting wants, and sometimes wanting to go for the same resources. Again, Marxists, for another point, let's say Marxists think, as you recall from Marxism and critical theory presentation, they argued that the First World War was empires trying to, let's say, get access to resources in other parts of the world, and a conflict ensuing from that. Conflicting wants for resources, etc. But it can also be desired how one is perceived, more constructivist. And it's more beneficial, according to a rationalist approach, to fighting than not. And here, but often both sides need to agree that a war's taken place, constructivism, and actually one side normally, historically at least, needed to surrender. Of course, it can be a bit messier in reality, but this is often how war is conceptualized. Obvious point here, you might say, but I wanted to put this here. If only one state fights, it's not a war. So who are they fighting? Well, and this is an important point I want to raise with you, to bear this in mind, not just for this module, but also when you look at different, let's say, think tanks, data sets for war, methodologically speaking, how is a war defined? Who is defined as the warring party? How many people need to be killed for it to be defined as a war? All very important methodological questions. So rationalist approach, cost-benefit analysis, this rational choice approach. War is always inefficient, and often, and this is where liberal institutionalists make the point, actually you can achieve your outcomes both sides, if you think of this win-win situation, through other approaches, diplomacy, trade, etc., etc. However, if one wants to look at it from a rational choice, so we see the access to perfect information, we do a cost-benefit analysis, we do a hierarchy of our preferences, and I'll say more about that in the foreign policy class. We often, as policymakers, one would think of what's the utility of war. So here is a formula: probability of winning times value of winning minus costs of war. Okay, so the probability with and the value of winning, each of these things minus the costs of war. And if it's the case that we can clearly see a positive result for this, then it makes it more likely that one would go to war, probability and value of winning. And again, I've put here a time sign, but even if you just put a plus sign, the point being that if it's clearly more from a plus sign now, probability and plus value of winning minus costs of war, if it's positive here, then that makes it likely that one would want to go to war, according to this rationalist explanation of war. And there's always bargaining, therefore, and bargaining between both actors, because often two-state actors actually don't necessarily want to go to war, but this is where if one side is clearly more powerful than the other, bargaining takes place. And usually there's an agreement made, but not always. Why fight instead of bargain? Well, there can sometimes be private information that you know something about the other side has a certain weakness, or you have a certain strength, a particular technology that you've developed as an actor. An inability to make credible commitments, lack of trust from one side to the other, and this is therefore a case of why one would want to fight, go to war rather than to bargain. And then there are more non-rationalist approaches: domestic politics, influenced by one's own citizenry, the CNN effect, how let's say the media plays a role, different actors, stakeholders trying to influence policymakers. And here we also bring in constructivism of a cultural value of war, how one gives prestige to one's own actors, what one, let's say, legitimizes who one is, or how legitimizes a particular state actor and who that state actor is and how it operates in the world. So there are more, let's say, what are known as non-rationalist approaches. And again, inability to make commitments. So you can't make commitments, and in this case, in this anarchical system, it means that it must be self-enforcing. Sometimes the state says, okay, no, we need to achieve this because within this anarchical system we can't, and therefore we need to do it. Power evolves over time, and for this reason, that at one stage an actor might see itself and it has a disadvantage, sees itself as having an advantage, and therefore makes it more attractive for it to fight. And this is where we get into, and to take an extreme example, the rise of China and the decline of the US, if we accept that terminology, we can see how in the most powerful of cases, most powerful states, how they sometimes can conflict historically, and we go back to the realist slides. Of course, one hopes in the case of the US and China, with the case of the material, let's say the economic and military resources they have, that they wouldn't go to war. But nonetheless, even if we think of, let's say, smaller countries, one country becoming more powerful, one declining, one becoming more powerful, this can lead to a conflictual situation unless policymakers prevent it. And this can lead to what is sometimes known as unattended conflict, etc. But again, there are, let's say, cases where we can be a bit more optimistic, and preventative war is something that's also where one can be more optimistic is let's say the wisdom of policymakers and other stakeholders. But preventative war is a war that says, okay, we know that unlike preemptive war, in preemptive war, let me distinguish between preemptive and preventative. So let me just bring up these two terms now. Preemptive war is when you know another actor is about to attack you, you have evidence for that, you bring it to the United Nations Security Council, so you legitimize it under international law, international security, that's it. Preventative war is when you see another actor, it's rising in power. And maybe, let's say 5, 10, 15 years down the line, it will, as a rising power, it might use military force against you, etc., etc. That's not legitimate under international law. But when there's a lack of trust and information, actor A is more likely to try to argue for a preventative war because it doesn't trust actor B or it wants to maintain its power, whatever the case might be. So a couple of things, more things on domestic incentives. So there are domestic incentives, and for, let's say, Margaret Thatcher, for the 1983 general election in the United Kingdom, there's a diversionary war. We could look at Cuba and Fidel Castro's government regime, Putin in Russia. So it can be used by a whole host of different actors. But United Kingdom and Margaret Thatcher in 1982, the Falkland Islands, or known in Spanish by the Argentinians as Las Malvinas, so Falkland Islands or Las Malvinas. I will use the term Falkland Islands, but bearing in mind it's politically contentious. War deliberately chosen by leaders arguably from both sides, from the Argentinian side and the military junta there invading the country, and then Thatcher's government, the UK, sending its own, let's say, battalion to fight against the Argentinian and then eventually win the war against Argentina. Both sides were trying to in a sense, diversionary war was created from the Argentinian side to legitimize this military junta, fascist dictatorship. Again, I'm not making a point per se on which side was right or wrong about the war, but just referring to this particular political regime in Argentina between 1976 and 1983. And arguably this loss of the war actually led to the eventual, let's say, end of this military junta and leadership and a democratization of Argentina. But there's a lot of complexity to that, I acknowledge. Anyway, Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands or Las Malvinas in 1982 meant that both the Argentinian leadership but also the British leadership got to rally around the flag. And whether it was the British public through the media, whether the Sun newspaper, the Daily Mail and others, promoting this as a patriotism, we have to fight this enemy, we have to protect the sovereignty of this small island, which is connected with the British state, the British crown, what have you. And Thatcher successfully did that. And arguably in Britain, with the economy doing badly, as well as also in Argentina, but in the British context, the 1983 general election, it was a very important factor in why, not the only factor per se against Michael Foot's Labour, in this particular context, but nonetheless, this was a clear factor in why Thatcher won a second term. And then she could go further forward with her own domestic reforms. But again, for Thatcher or the military junta in Argentina, it was a rally around the flag that even if you disagree with us politically, because you are Argentinian or because you are British, you are going to support what we do. And this will make us more popular, because wars often tend to make a leader more popular, at least the fighting of a war. An imperial expansionary war, often not rational for a state as a whole, but profitable for the ruling minority. So sometimes elites within a society, historically there were imperial powers using it for let's say, and this was something that benefited elites, and states would sometimes directly take control of others. But often, and again here, when we think of the post-Cold War context, we think of sub-states, actually the ruling minority, they benefit from it. So not just sub-states, but state actors like Russia having an influence or taking territory, and in the case of Crimea, that it's profitable for the ruling minority in Crimea, but also for the Kremlin itself. And so expansionary war and the United States are also culpable here, not just Russia, but a range of different countries can use this to actually increase the profits, mainly for the ruling minority, whether in the state itself or for those in the capital that invades another country. War is an inherent good, and this is where fascism and fascist thought in the early mid-20th century was very preeminent. But it is also something where constructivists, and arguably you could say more negative aspect of constructivism, because constructivism is agnostic, it can be more positive or more negative in terms of politically speaking. It's how we are socialized, how identity creates our interests. But actually, there can be more glory in victory than in negotiation. We fight for ourselves. And again, it doesn't have to be fascistic. It can be across the political spectrum. But it often has been used as an inherent good by fascist regimes in Europe in the 20th century, as we can see. And this notion that feminists, again, would, rightly so, I would argue, but this notion of creating masculinity, creating force, creating it in a way, but it can also be very conflictual. But war as an inherent good is something that historically, as we know, was something that was, let's say, how we were socialized. Constructivism was something that was more the norm, less so today. Again, that's why people don't argue for war as an inherent good. There's always other reasons. That's how you justify going to war. And again, to take, let's say, cleansing or purging another group. Sometimes religion or religious fundamentalism has played this role historically. War can be an inherent good in changing the order. Turn to, let's say, like a revolution, political and social order, overthrowing it. War is inherently good in a number of cases. However, and there are many, of course, critical theorists and others, and even realists themselves, that sometimes are put in this war category. They themselves say actually it's not necessarily good, and actually often it can make things worse for all parties concerned. Now, for let's say for class, here is a guiding question: why do wars occur? Again, based on what I've just presented in your reading. So again, I want to thank you for your attention. And just want to say that, let's say, we do the reading, of course, of War and International Security. Looking at in class, we're going to go into a range of questions. And just to thank you again, and bear in mind that, let's say, whether the theoretical, conceptual, historical context that I've given to what war is, what security is, how war itself has developed over time, these factors I want you to think about from this presentation, consider, and we'll talk more in class. So all the best, and again, see you in class. Take care. Bye-bye.